After America is made on the lands of the Kure, Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. We acknowledge that they and their ancestors have cared for the lands, rivers and sea, and all living creatures for thousands of generations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi, I'm Emma Shortis, and this is After America. Diplomacy is hard work at the best of times. The Australian Prime Minister is in China this week.
Talking up Australian tourism and sport. But his visit has again been overshadowed by the White House.
The Pentagon calling for Australia to explain what role it would play if the US went to war over Taiwan.
We want peace and security in our region. We are investing in our capability and investing in our relationship.
The week-long trip was meant to focus on trade, but that's been complicated by Trump's AUKUS review. There are suggestions that the administration might come back asking for more money and a guarantee that the submarines would be used in a conflict with China. This is not, it's safe to say, the best of times. Back at home, scepticism about the deal is growing. New polling by the Australia Institute has found that 66% of Australians now support a parliamentary inquiry into AUKUS. That's up on 57% in a similar poll we did a few months ago. Australia remains the only party to the deal that hasn't had a review, which is pretty wild when we're the ones paying. And it's even wilder when we consider what our most important security partner is doing to its allies, let alone its enemies.
In a blow for Australian industries, Donald Trump announced he'll impose high tariffs on copper and pharmaceuticals.
If they have to bring the pharmaceuticals into the country, the drugs and other things into the country, they're going to be tariffed at a very, very high rate, like 200%.
They're obviously very concerning developments. We are talking about billions of dollars of exports to the US when it comes to pharmaceuticals.
Last week, we got further confirmation that Big Pharma in the US is coming after Australia's pharmaceutical benefits scheme. And now we know they have Trump's support after the president floated a 200% tariff on pharmaceutical exports to the US. That tariff would hurt Australian industry, but it would hurt Americans more, many of whom rely on those products for their health and well-being. So much of what Trump is doing hurts Americans' interests. It was lost in the constant flood, but this week the Trump administration also cut over 1,300 positions at the State Department. Trump is making America and the world less secure and catastrophically undermining his administration's ability to conduct diplomacy responsibly and respond to crises. But sure, he deserves the Nobel Peace Prize. Why not? Who better to talk to about all this than an actual, real-life Nobel Peace Prize winner? Our friend Dr Ruth Mitchell is a board member of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, which won the Peace Prize in 2017. She's also a neurosurgeon at the Sydney Children's Hospital and the Prince of Wales Hospital, and the chair of the Board of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. Ruth and I talked about nuclear non-proliferation after the American bombing of Iran, how RFK Jr. is wreaking havoc in the US health system, and a little bit about Jane Fonda. Here's Ruth now. Ruth, welcome back to After America. It's been a while.
Thank you, Emma. It's always good to see you.
Lovely to chat to you, as always. And I couldn't resist beginning by asking you, as our very favourite Nobel Peace Prize winner, what do you reckon about Trump's nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize by Benjamin Netanyahu?
So many feelings, so many thoughts. I think the thing is that because I've been fortunate enough to meet quite a few Nobel Peace laureates, I know what kind of people rise to the challenge of making the kind of difference in the world that gets them a Nobel Peace Prize. And what I have observed is the traits of a Nobel Peace laureate are extraordinary courage, conviction, determination, an ability to do the right thing, even if it's the very hardest thing, to provide moral leadership when it's lacking, and the price that has been paid by so many of the really extraordinary people that are given this honor often includes being thrown in jail, being tortured. You know, it's not infrequent that someone will be awarded the prize in count of 10 because they're in jail in their own country. And we also see extraordinary efforts made by the people who, who stand to lose from these people bearing witness and doing good work, to silence them and to undermine them. And so there's a completely different kind of person than the president of the United States currently who are actually being honored in this way. It's obvious that, someone like Trump really would love to get this because he just thinks it's like a gong, it's an honor, it's a feather in his cap. But, when ICANN won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017, I think that we really felt like the real prize wasn't the Nobel, it was the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And so most of the laureates I've met have that perspective that it's not really about the prize, it's always about the work.
Mm.
And nothing could be farther from the perspective that Trump has. So if he'd like to get a Nobel Peace Prize, he should do something Nobel Peace Prize worthy, like get rid of nuclear weapons, like stop funding genocide, stop arming genocide. There are so many, he's in the better position than anyone to do good in the world. So if he'd like a Nobel Peace Prize, Trump, if you would like a Nobel Peace Prize, get rid of nuclear weapons. That would be a good way to get that done. That's how I feel about that. And the other thing to say is people think there's some sort of kudos attached to being nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. But in fact, thousands of people are nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize every single year. And it's not the case that just because someone got like 57 nominations, like now they're, at the top of it's not Eurovision, So, which is good. But yeah, I think it's an interesting time, and people asking me, like, what do you think about this? I'm like, well, he doesn't deserve one. But I also feel that the Nobel process is robust enough that we can be very confident he's not getting one.
Mm. Well, I mean, the fact that the Instagram account for the Nobel Peace Prize put up exactly what you've just said, saying it's actually meaningless for somebody to be nominated. Thousands of people are nominated, I think is,
exactly.
I mean, hopefully a fairly strong indication of what's not to come, that he's not going to get it. But Ruth, you mentioned, the kind of leader that Trump is and some of the appalling things that he is doing in the world. And since we last spoke, which was a while ago now, you've been all over the world. I think you've probably been back to Canada since I last spoke to you. I know you've been to Vanuatu.
Yes.
You even, to my deep and everlasting jealousy, got to see Jane Fonda speak at one point.
Yes.
What is your, given that you've been doing so much traveling, what is your sense of how the rest of the world is responding to Trump and what's happening in the States?
Well, I'm glad you raised Jane Fonda because she's a bit of a legend and a bit of a beacon. And, she's in her late 80s and she has been arrested scores of times. There I was at the convention center with 5,000 other of her closest friends and fans, a very large cross-section of Sydney society, I guess. And what I found so interesting was the thing she was the most passionate about when she was speaking. And in particular, she talked about what it's like to get arrested. And she talks about how freeing it felt to have like someone put handcuffs on you and feel like you're completely aligned to your purpose because you're standing up for what is good and what is right in the face of evil. And I thought that is very inspiring to hear that characterization of alignment. And I think it's such a juxtaposition to the kind of incongruence and the chaos and the disconnection that everyone feels in the wake of just the like chaotic, disastrous mismanagement that we're seeing from the Trump administration in literally every sphere of life in the United States and in so many ways that spill out into the rest of the world. And, some people just retire. Like some people who are still working full time are like acting like they're retired. And I felt very strongly in her actions and in her example, a real call to action. I hope the 5,000 people in the room kind of got the memo. Like this isn't a time for despair. It's a time for action and courage, determination. It's a privilege to be able to get arrested and think that you're not going to get disappeared. It takes being a very high profile white woman is one way of avoiding the things that happen to Black and brown bodies in the carceral system and at the hands of the police. But she's using every ounce of her privilege. And I think it's incumbent on us to think about what that looks like here too.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's such an important point. Jane Fonda is not, at least not yet, going to be deported to El Salvador or something awful like that, which the Trump administration is, actively doing and going to increase after this latest bill.
The big issue for pharmaceutical makers in Australia is still the issue of the PBS.
Our assurance to the Australian people is that PBS is not for negotiation, it's not for sale.
So American drug companies are saying our PBS scheme is unfair. Do they have any argument at all here?
Really, their argument is they'd like to sell insulin for $100 a pop instead of $7, or anti-anxiety medication for $420 a box instead of $20 a box. I mean, that's really their argument.
Ruth, you mentioned the things that are galvanising people, I suppose. If we turn to Australia now, one of the things that Trump has recently done is threatened to hit pharmaceutical exports and go after the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. And that seems like it might be something that would galvanise people here in Australia. What do you think's going on here with this threat to now hit Australia with a 200% tariff?
Well, it's I don't think it's an idle threat, unfortunately. But I think it is galvanizing, like the kind of chat that I hear in my sector and in the health sector. You know, hands off the PBS is really the feeling I'm getting. And it is kind of almost like it's bracing. It's like jumping into cold water or something. It's like a bit of a wake-up call that these policies could directly affect each one of us and our most sick and vulnerable patients, you know, the most vulnerable members of our society. When you look at the comparisons of how much a whole bunch of really important basic medications cost, I'm not talking about like Ozempic, I'm talking about like a salbutamol like puffer, like the blue inhaler that everyone who has significant asthma will have in their bag or handbag. We're paying something in the order of $6 or $7 for that here on the PBS, and it's orders of magnitude more that you pay per unit in the United States for that. And so, of course, the pharmaceutical industry has every desire in the world to undermine our PBS because it provides a cost control for that whole sector. That the government is the person is the entity that's buying most of these medications means that a mass purchaser gets to negotiate the price, and so anything to break that would be very attractive for that sector. And so it's an area where we have to be really clear and really firm and be absolutely feel very free to call your MP and make sure they understand that this is not something that we think is like negotiable. This cannot be a target. It's one of the biggest determinants of health for our most vulnerable community members is being able to access critical medication at an affordable price point. It's a big thing.
Which, as you say, is a pretty big contrast to the situation in the States where the healthcare system was already pretty badly broken, even before Trump. We've spoken a bit when you've been on the show before about the Trump administration's approach to health, enabled, of course, by RFK Jr.
Yes.
It seems like that's going about as well as you expected.
Well, that's it. So, I found myself making a whole bunch of dire predictions and like they're all coming true, a lack of respect for evidence, for science, for facts, for logic. And the thing that I've been distressed by in the rhetoric that I've seen recently there is, it's like anti-public health framework. So instead of thinking about determinants of health, instead of thinking of the fact that people need like healthy neighborhoods that aren't food deserts, access to clean drinking water and ability to get decent exercise in a safe environment, like these are the things that make sure people are well, then there's this idea that what's needed is like apps and some way of like tracking individuals to try and promote individual health behaviors. And we all know, like the public health evidence is clear that that's not where we shift the dial on disease at a community level, at a population level. We need to provide connection and well-being at the broadest levels. And that's all of what he's undermining and slashing and burning and putting the responsibility for health onto an individual who lives in a food desert, who, lives in a concrete jungle, who has variable access to, the fact that there's parts of the United States where there's no healthy drinking water. Like, this is evil. Like, it's really, really evil. And so I think seeing the tone of it, it starts to feel like, it's got some eugenic kind of tones to it. It's like, well, some people aren't going to survive. It's like, yeah, well, I wonder who isn't going to survive. And why isn't everyone mad about that as a suggestion? That cannot be allowed to stand, and yet it is. So it's more than, just soaring measles rates. It's like everything rates.
Yeah, and it seems like it's going to get worse. Like even if we go back to this threat to put tariffs on Australian pharmaceutical exports, that hurts Americans more than it would ever hurt the Australian economy.
Yeah.
It's depriving
Yeah.
Americans of vaccines that they need for their health and their well-being.
Yeah. Oh, but vaccines. Why would you use those, Emma?
Yeah, it's terrifying on a number of levels. One of the other big pieces of news that's likely to come out of the States is, of course, this review of the AUKUS submarine deal that the Trump administration is doing. Ruth, what do you make, I guess, broadly speaking, of the Australian government's approach to Trump when it comes to this review of AUKUS?
Well, I think it's telling that there's a review going on in the United States, and there's, parliamentary review in the United Kingdom. And we're the ones who are paying so far, hundreds of millions of dollars and quickly ticking over into the billions of dollars of money that, quite frankly, I think, as we've discussed before, we can all think of 953 other priorities for every single one of those dollars, which would be much more advantageous to both our natural environment, the well-being and health of our planet, but also to the well-being and health of Australians and people who live here. Terrible, terrible criminal waste of money. We're the ones who are paying the price. We're footing the bill. And we're doing the least to actually participate in due diligence about whether this actually represents a good idea. And so times are tough when, even the Trump administration is having at least a cursory look into whether this is a decent idea, whether this represents a good deal, and we're not willing to reflect on that. That is not a mature position. That doesn't represent any kind of sound, vibrant democracy situation. It's poor governance that we have not had our own parliamentary inquiry into this. I think we're all ready for that to happen, and I think that needs to occur. So, the fact that I don't know what the outcome will be of that process in the United States, but the fact that it exists at all and that we don't even have that here it's deeply shaming.
Absolutely. And we at the Australia Institute have got a petition to that end calling for a parliamentary inquiry into AUKUS. So we will pop again a link to that in the show notes, because it's worth emphasizing how extraordinary that is. I was talking to a Swiss journalist a couple of weeks ago, and he could not believe, because he comes from a place which has direct democracy, where they vote on big questions like this. He could not believe that Australia would make a decision this big without any kind of even conversation about it, let alone a consultation. It's wild,
It's horrifying. And it speaks to the fact that we do all sorts of crazy things without checking with, without it even going through Parliament. Never mind having any kind of referendum or inquiry or national process of discovering what is the will of the people. If something hasn't come up in the specific context of being the rhetoric around the time of a federal election, then our federal government seems to think that they have that they've been written a blank check to do whatever they want with. And I don't think that's adequate. I don't think that represents a healthy, thriving democracy at all. We're a number of steps removed from that, and we have to push back. So please sign the petition. I have. I'll sign it. Can I sign it again? And sign early, sign often.
That sort of, all of that fits in, of course, to the way, as you were saying, Australia approaches foreign policy. I think in particular, it's not isolated to that, but foreign policy in particular.
Precisely.
Though I think, in foreign policy, if we zoom out a little bit and look at how the Australian government is responding to Trump more broadly, it seems to me like there have been at least some hints that there might be some pushback. I'm thinking of Albanese saying in response to Hegseth, saying we should spend this much on defence, saying no.
What you should do in defence is decide what you need, your capability, and then provide for it. What we don't do is do what the opposition did during the election campaign, where they announced an amount of money. They couldn't say where the money was coming from, and they couldn't say what it was for.
So there have been little hints about potential pushback. But then, of course, the Australian government will do things like support the Trump administration's bombing of Iran, which has no legitimacy in international law. How do you see, Ruth, the response of the Australian government to Trump if we kind of zoom out and look at the big picture?
So I think, hints is what we've seen. And I don't envy the current administration,
God, no.
having to figure out how to navigate this. Like, you've got a toddler in the White House, and like, how do you talk to someone whose main activity is throwing his toys out of, the playpen? Like, it's very difficult to know how do you professionally and diplomatically engage with such a volatile, unpredictable, erratic, unprincipled government. It's very difficult, and it is very hard for our government to pivot to understanding that this is not a friend acting like a friend at this particular point in history, despite all of the shared history we have before. That relationship isn't being respected by the United States. And so it's hard for us to be, what does it look like to be respectful and yet also realistic in the way that we deal with the Trump administration? But I think that despite all the difficulties, that there's a necessity for plain speaking, like, clarity on, more of the pushback of like, no, actually, we'll decide what we spend money on. There needs to be way more of that. And I think it's important for Australians to hear the government doing that pushback out loud and saying, actually, like, we're going to try and be a sovereign nation over here, and we've not been, as we've discussed many times, there's several steps lacking from an independent foreign policy in Australia. But I do think this time represents an opportunity to develop that. I think it's necessary that we develop that. But now it's like not just important, but quite urgent that we develop an independent standing on all of these things.
Yeah, I mean, you won't be surprised to know that I couldn't agree more. Does that mean that you think on the issue of those Trump administration attacks on Iran, for example, that the Australian government should have been stronger, for example, in standing up for the principles of international law?
I absolutely do. But at the moment, like, the Australian government can't be taken very seriously on international law because there's been a complete abrogation of our obligations under international law to stand up. I mean, the Convention on Genocide is one example of something we seem to have discarded as being relevant. Yeah. We have obligations under international law in many categories, and that has been tested. We've been tested, and we have been found wanting as a nation in standing up for the system that, we claim to think is important when it affects us or our mates. But you don't just bomb on people for fun. Like, this is not a recreational activity. Even wars have rules. And I think when we just side with the biggest bully in the playground, it makes us look really silly. And we have to be very clear about what we do want to prioritize. So I would have liked to have seen a completely different response to the US involvement in bombing in Iran. I would have wanted to see something that is much more aligned with international law. And we have to realize that if we give up on these international norms, which we basically have, then, that there's that line from the song, if you tolerate this, then your children will be next. And I don't think we've felt that enough. I don't think we've sat with that enough.
Or just, realize, going back to what you were saying earlier about Trump being a bully, that it doesn't matter what we give him. It doesn't matter how much support we give him. He will still continue to turn on us. He's showed us that just in the last couple of days. I suspect as well, Ruth, the strength of your feeling about this, based in the clear evidence of Australia, the Australian government not standing up for those principles of international law, even before Trump, it's worth, I think, emphasising that Trump didn't create any of this, is that the risk that the Trump administration's attacks on Iran in particular, will accelerate nuclear proliferation. Of course, the pretense for these attacks was that Iran was close to developing a nuclear weapon, for which we have no real evidence.
No evidence. There's no verification of that whatsoever.
No, none. And they didn't even really pretend. Or
no, it's so flimsy.
Absolutely. And many experts have argued that, in fact, rather than mitigating against the risk of nuclear proliferation or the development of nuclear weapons, it's actually made that risk significantly worse. Is that your view as well?
Well, I think that when we pay deference to countries that do have nuclear weapons, I mean, the classic here is that Israel has nuclear weapons. They do not participate in inspections by the IAEA. They officially deny that they have nuclear weapons. And it's important for the United States that they continue to pretend that they don't have them because, there's US law that says that you can't provide military aid to a country that has or is developing nuclear weapons. So there's an important strategic and tactical reason why Israel will continue to deny having those nuclear weapons. You know, when we pay deference to and support a nuclear weapon state that doesn't even admit to having them, that doesn't submit to inspections by the IAEA and so forth, and then, you know, a country that, from what we're able to appreciate, does not have nuclear weapons and has been, for the most part, participating in IAEA inspections, gets bombed willy-nilly, it does send a signal that we respect nuclear weapon states and we don't respect those that aren't. And that is the kind of thing that does drive proliferation risk, because it provides support for the idea of deterrence. And we know that in the long term, deterrence doesn't work, that it's a false framework. It's a lie, but it gives some credibility to that flimsy framework. And I worry about that, because countries around the world who are feeling maligned and cast aside by the changing winds of time, like this is not the right signal to be sending at an international level. It's the opposite of leadership.
Yeah, I think that's a very accurate way of putting it. And all of this means, I think, Ruth, that, you know, we do live in a more dangerous world, you know, as a direct result of the actions of the Trump administration. But you, this weekend, in fact, even before this episode is released, you're heading there. You're heading into the center of all this, going off to the States. How are we feeling about that?
So I think that I have made my peace with whatever happens. I think that at the beginning of the Trump administration, last time I said, I'm not traveling to the States during the Trump administration. And this time I said, there wouldn't be many things I would go for. But I've been invited to a Nobel assembly organized by a number of Nobel laureates, not just peace laureates, but also a number of laureates in physics, who are very concerned about the escalating risk of nuclear war and the use of nuclear weapons. And if there's any time for courage, it's right now. And so I think that for me, it's, you know, both the complexity of rearranging my clinical schedule to free up time so that I can actually be away, and, you know, very grateful to my colleagues for helping that to work. But I think there's a time to courageously participate in high-level discussions with the brightest minds we've got, to try and think about what can we reasonably do? What can we practically do to address this mounting risk? And I think so much about the obligations we have to each other and the obligations we have to our communities. And, you know, once you've kind of seen it, you can't unsee it, the injustice in the world and the asymmetry of having so much power and resource invested in weapons that do nothing but destroy. You can't unsee that. And so, like, as a surgeon, I'm like, well, I would like to cut that out now. Like, let us figure out what is the operation that we need to do. Like, what is the intervention that we need to participate in to make this a different place than it is? How do we eliminate this disease? And as I think about that, I've been thinking about a book that I'm almost finished reading that has been just a really helpful thing for me in this last little while. And that is a book called Moral Ambition. And, you know, in this book, the author really explores, what does it look like to not just pick your battles and fight the good fight, but actually win? And he argues that particularly on the left and in progressive spaces, we have been insufficiently attached to outcomes. And I mean, his biggest, it's Rutger Bregman is the author, but he talks about how, you know, we actually need to land the plane. We have to, you know, we have to get some runs on the board with some of our progressive ideas and the outcomes that we need. They actually have to happen. So it's not enough just to have good intentions and goodwill, but we have to be strategic and significant with the brainpower we've been given. So he feels like the most ambitious people we have should be working on the biggest problems we have instead of working for McKinsey, for example. And I really find that resonates deeply with me, because I know a great many very bright people who have spent a lot of their best years working in consulting, and imagine what it would be like if they were instead running the parts of the world that really need that brain power. So I think it's a useful book. It's been very practical and useful for me. And yeah, I recommend it. Book recommendation.
Thank you. We always appreciate those. And I am also positive that Jane Fonda would agree with your assessment there, Ruth, and be very proud that you're heading to the States for such an important reason, as am I. So proud to have you on the show, and thank you so much for your generosity and your time.
Well, thank you for having me. It is always a tonic to speak to you, Emma, and thank you for your deep and probing look at all the things that really matter.
It's always our pleasure, Ruth, to have you, and good luck with the trip, and hopefully we'll be able to get you back to hear all about it.
Yes, if I make it back, I'll tell you all about it.
Thanks, Ruth.
Take care.
If you want to read more from the Australia Institute, you can pre-order the second edition in our Vantage Point series. Dead Centre, How Political Pragmatism is Killing Us by Richard Dennis explores the contradiction between centrism and evidence that sits at the heart of democratic debate in Australia. You can pre-order it now for $19.95 or become a subscriber to the Vantage Point series via our website, australiainstitute.org.au/store, or tap the link in the show notes. This episode was recorded on Friday, the 11th of July. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. We'll be back next week. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.